everybody, welcome back to the channel. In today's show, we're down on the Clearwater Subdivision chasing down train L791. Now there's a lot to see and a lot to explore. So let's get started this morning just south of downtown Clearwater. Although Jacksonville has plenty of historic and interesting lines to chase down, there's something about Tampa branch lines that'll always draw me back. I'm not sure if it's the fact that just a few decades ago, Amtrak would run right through here, or that these lines are rarely filmed and published in a cohesive manner, but either way, this week in late May, I'd set aside a morning to track down local train L791. L791 is the daily Clearwater switcher, about half the time heading north by east towards Tampa to pick up cars for the area, or headed south to St. Petersburg and the end of the line. This Clearwater job is one of the last Tampa-based locals that doesn't start out in Yeoman Yard in Tampa, in our case beginning the day here just south of downtown Clearwater at the town and namesake subdivision's yard office and crew facility. To our south is Bel Air Siding, a common spot for power to be tied down at or a cut of cars to be stored in. Today, all empty, as the St. Pete bound train would already be coupled to its locomotive, evidence of a thoughtful L791 crew from yesterday afternoon. The Clearwater Sub, like many in the state, is a mix of both seaboard and Atlantic coastline trackage, with seaboard heritage beginning in Tampa, running north to Sulphur Springs along the old Tampa Northern, and then turning west onto the old Tampa and Gulf Coast Railroad towards the coast. Tampa Northern's line continues north as seaboard trackage towards Brooksville, now CSX's Brooksville Sub, an all too familiar stretch of track on this channel. The TN and the Tampa and Gulf Coast would both eventually fall under the control of the seaboard in the early 20th century, with the Tampa Northern's name still alive today in the form of an at-grade interlocking between this Clearwater Sub and the ACL's A-line into downtown Tampa, named TN. At Sulphur Springs, the Tampa and Gulf Coast Railroad would begin building west, towards Oldsmar, where after crossing the very top of Tampa Bay, the line bends south to hug the bay into Safety Harbor. From there, a couple of twists and turns guide the rails across the peninsula from bay to Gulf at Clearwater, where a junction with the old Orange Belt, soon the Atlantic coastline, once existed. At the south side of Clearwater, the rivalry between the SAL and the ACL would ignite, after the two railroads would absorb the original track lane companies. For a short stretch, the ACL and SAL would parallel each other through town, before crossing over each other where we are this morning, as the seaboard would continue south through Bel Air, Ridgecrest, Seminole, Bay Pines, and finally into St. Petersburg, with the ACL taking a much more direct diagonal routing to St. Pete via Largo, Pinellas Park, and Lealman. Well, as most of you know, the two railroads were merged in 1967, and so were the two rail lines into St. Pete, with the ACL's trackage being chosen as the main line, making the seaboard side redundant and on the chopping block. After its abandoning in the late 60s, the right-of-way would be bought by the county and turned into the present-day Pinellas Trail. Many memories of the old rivalry still exist in the archives of Fred Clark and Mike Robbins, two ahead-of-their-time rail fans who were lucky captured plenty of this area's heavy railroad scene from the 60s through the 90s. This scene is from the old Clearwater Diamond, just after the 1967 merger, and just before the seaboard's track in the foreground would be ripped up. Soon after the merger, Amtrak would begin operations along the very right-of-way that the SCL would create by combining the seaboard into the coastline at Clearwater, seen here in the early 1970s with Clearwater's downtown in the background. Following the line north out of Tampa, signal territory used to end at Sulphur Springs, where the 49-mile Brooksville subdivision begins. At one time, this junction hosted a depot and yard office, local switcher, and signals that would guide Amtrak and freights alike through the junction. Again, we're extremely grateful to the incredible work of Mike Robbins and Fred Clark for all these photos. They document history and times that no longer exist, as this is what Sulphur Springs looks like today. The industrial spur that used to follow Bush Boulevard to the east is no longer, along with the engine track now shortened to a runaround for local switchers to use. This junction is no longer signaled either, save for the interlocking dwarf signal that protects the spring switch here. 30 miles to the west is Largo, where a heritage museum now houses the old depot for all to see, with weekly hours ranging from Wednesday through Saturday. Although it's been painted back into its original green coat, the building still remains as a landmark and a sign of the times, in an era where the modern railroad depot is all but extinct. Moving back towards Clearwater, the line continues with the occasional siding that once hosted meets of Amtrak St. Petersburg-bound trains. In this 1983 Tampa Division timetable from the SCL, the line was still part of the Lakeland Sub, carrying 6 daily Amtraks, including the Champion, Silver Palm, and Silver Star. Today, sidings like the one here at Belair are used strictly for runaround moves, storage, and the very rare meet with extra trains that may run down here. It's a Tuesday, and normal operations consist of a run down south from our post at Clearwater to St. Petersburg and the end of the line. We're staring at train L791, who's currently sitting on the curve at Seaboard's milepost SY 875.6 and Atlantic Coastline's ARE 882.6. Bel Air siding was once a pickup point on the railroad, with an ACL piggyback ramp still upright down the tracks, where trucks would be loaded onto train, a business that has been completely phased out of the industry. Under the careful watch of a tall osprey, 791 begins his morning at 0700 on the dot, with a couple blasts of the horn and a southbound throttle. At milepost ARE 885 is Largo, where many moons ago, Mr. Robbins captured the southbound Silver Star coming around the bend, today a nicely landscaped shot for a slow passing of this subdivision's only daily train. There are plenty of long traffic lights and plenty more traffic around Clearwater this morning, but even with that and the inconvenience of chasing a diagonal train line with only north-south roads, 791 is a pretty easy train to jump ahead of as the train creeps out of Clearwater yard limits, restricting the train to 10 miles per hour the rest of the way south.
L791 19, 6532 Paterno, 1A main track both directions between South Clearwater yard limits main and South St. Petersburg yard limits main. Circle line 10, dispatcher message 37813 is annulled, over.
At milepost ARE 892 is Pinellas Park, another busy community along the line where a house track still resides, now seldom used outside of maintenance of way staging or the uncommon single carload transload. As many towns did, Pinellas Park once hosted a depot and freight house, now long gone, along with much of the online business of the area. Where 3 different rail-served customers once operated just north of us, now sits a park, the county's public work office, and a neighborhood, all passing landmarks for 791, who trundles by without stop. Four miles to the south, and we've now entered the St. Petersburg yard limits, which once hosted the SEL St. Pete Yard and Amtrak's St. Pete Station, built by ACL in 1959. Note the bridge to the right of 791, evidence of a second track that once ran through here. For 13 years, Amtrak operated right here, out of the large white building you see now. Renovation in the early 2000s brought down the old station coverings and some of the platform, along with a new look for the Art Deco style building. Yet 67 years later, the station still stands. Like I said, the design has changed a bit, colors dulled to a pale white concrete all the way around, and overgrown Florida vegetation has separated the buildings from the tracks. But it's still crazy to me that all these years later, the now abandoned station still stands. 6 daily trains used to serve the station from 1971 to 1984. When service was cut back to Tampa, and the facilities here in St. Pete and all over Pinellas County were abandoned. With a 20-mile commute now easily accessible to Tampa's Union Station by car, thanks to new construction of bridges across the bay, Amtrak's 40-mile route to St. Pete was finally deemed too expensive for its dwindling passengers. So in '84, the last train ran, and that was that. South from the station, it's only a couple more miles to the end of the line at Carroll's Building Supplies in St. Petersburg. Running overhead is Interstate 275, the Tampa bypass that serves the communities on Tampa's west side from Wesley Chapel down to Bradenton, including St. Pete and Tropicana Field. Looking south, the Trop is just a little ways past the end of track, which once ran into downtown St. Pete and a small port where the pier now resides. Cut years ago, this ACL track used to connect to the seaboard just south of our post, now sold to the county from Carroll south to the Trop to be used as another trail. The seaboard from here in St. Pete to Clearwater is already the Pinellas Trail, with its once fiery competitor in the ACL seeing the same fate just a few years later. On the business end of the line, Carroll's is still a very busy place, as 791 drops off their loads for the customer, who now occupies the entirety of the old St. Pete yard, seen in the 1970s with its 11 tracks and 275 construction well underway. They might not have known it then, but that bridge going up would draw over half of this line's business away to Tampa and the end of passenger service just a few years later. Today, 791 would have an easy day of dropping off loads and spotting a few more for Carroll's, as they'd be back in just a day to pick up more from the customer. Receiving aggregate products from CSX, Carroll's is all that remains down here at the south end of the Clearwater Sub, as 791 creeps into St. Pete Yard, where Amtrak locomotives were once serviced and 4 daily through freights terminated. My favorite shot in St. Pete is this view with Tropicana Field, as 791 would switch underneath. Home to the current best team in all of Major League Baseball, this scene may not be possible in a decade or so, as plans to bring the Rays home progress with a new stadium deal, which would bring the Rays to Tampa, where they belong. .791 would wrap up his day of switching here, departing back for Clearwater this morning at 10 a.m., engines light. There's still plenty to see in St. Pete, although the only moving train would be out of sight and out of mind now. But that doesn't change the history of this area, one that's rich with the railroad industry and still visible today. From St. Pete Yard, I'd mosey south by west around the Trop to the old Seaboard, now the Pinellas Trail, that still runs right next door to the SAL's 1926-built St. Pete Station. Replaced in the late 1950s by a newer brick depot north of town, which would be sold off by the ACL merger, the old brick 1926 structure still stands tall here 100 years later, housing a number of small businesses. Still wearing its Seaboard heritage proudly, the station was once the end of the line for the Seaboard, located just north of where the line would interchange with the ACL and run together as one to the port. That's not far from here, although the port is now a marina and local industry has moved across the bay to Tampa. Nowadays, the communities of Vinoy and North Shore share the space along the water, accessible by car up Beach Drive. The swaying palms and clear skies would paint St. Pete in a beautifully vintage Super 8's color grade, with its rising condos, parks, and local shops opening up for lunchtime. Crazy to imagine that this was once all Portland at one point, yet it's the reason why there's anything here in the first place. From downtown, I'd grab a coffee and roll back north up the line to Pinellas Park, where the obligatory stop at Zyknik trains would await. This place has it all and is run by some of the nicest folks around. You can shop their extensive in-store selection in all scales, and they'll even order you back-ordered products, shipping them right to your door when ready. Last up on this adventure would be Bay Pines, where the Tampa and Gulf Coast would build a wooden trestle off of Cross Bayou as they traverse south to St. Pete. The Seaboard's depot here was moved from the main line to the VA hospital just south, where I'd go next. The depot now houses the VA's small police department and office space, which 2 officers would greet me at to inform me that filming on the property was strictly prohibited. So I'd snap this picture, and that was that. Bay Pines would be my last stop for the day, ending off a great morning trackside, one filled with history and plenty of action. Thanks for sticking with me to the end here. I appreciate the support more than you know. But until we meet again somewhere out there trackside, this is Christian from Multicolor Films. End of transmission.